Welcome everyone to the Climate-Wise Business Network webinar on what does a PC government mean for green businesses here in Ontario. We're just going to give everybody a minute or so just to come in, and then we'll start the formal program. Okay, welcome again everyone to the Climate-Wise Business Network webinar on what does a PC government mean for green business here in Ontario. Many of you are familiar with the Climate-Wise Business Network. We're part of the Windfall Ecology Centre here located in Aurora. Climate-Wise is part of the larger Green Economy Canada hubs across Ontario. We are an organization that focuses on working with, in this case, York Region businesses, helping them, supporting them, helping them celebrate and reach goals with respect to greenhouse gas reductions and environmental sustainability in general. Climate-Wise helps its members in such events as you'll see today, which is the networking events and learning workshops. We provide one-on-one coaching to organizations and businesses who are members in terms of GHG reductions, access to various tools to assess feasibility and carbon accounting footprints, as well as celebrating and recognizing all our members' events through our evening of recognition. Our organization really focuses on helping our members understand the bottom line benefits of GHG reductions, understanding how their employees value organizations who are engaged in environmental sustainability activities. Like this webinar today, we keep our members up to date on what's happening from a regulatory, incentive, and legislative perspective. And certainly we know that our members benefit when their customers and stakeholders and investors absolutely insist that they do things that achieve some of the GHG reductions that we need to achieve in Canada. We can be contacted in a number of different ways on our LinkedIn account, our Twitter account, and of course there's Climate-Wise at Windfall Centre. These are shown on those of you who have a computer. It's very clear, but just check our website, www.windfall.com/Climate-Wise, and you'll find us. GoToWebinar is what we're using today. Our format will be straightforward for those who have been on in the past. Since we are doing it on a webinar with 4 interesting panelists, we are going to create the opportunity for participants to participate as well, but through questions that they will add in our chat box and submit those in the chat box, and we'll organize those to ask them at the end. You'll be able to see some material on the site. If you have your computers in front of you, so we'll be recording the webinar, and we will be sending it out to you after the webinar is over. So those of you who are participants will be muted. We're going to ask the panelists, I think now, just to mute themselves, and I will be directing questions to them. The way this process will work today is we'll start off with some questions that we have thought about and consulted on with others to our panelists. I'm going to direct specific questions to specific panelists to begin, and then all the panelists will be given the opportunity to comment on that question. Certainly we're going to look for a little spontaneity, but because we're on a technology and on a webinar here, it's a little more difficult to manage from that regard, but we'll do our best. Once the panelists have done their questions, which will be the bulk of the seminar, the webinar, which is about 40 minutes, we'll leave 10 minutes or so at the end for the participants to raise questions on the chat box. I do want to make it clear, though, because of the nature of the webinar, that Windfall Ecology Center does not endorse the opinions expressed by the panelists. We certainly value them, want to have an open and constructive conversation amongst panelists, but it is not by definition what Windfall's positions are on these things. Today, we're very, very happy and pleased to have four eminent panelists with us, and I want to thank them right up front for the contribution of their time to this. This webinar, by the way, has close to 80 people that have registered for it, and more are coming on as we're talking. So clearly there was a very high interest in this topic, and certainly why wouldn't there be after 15 years of one government looking at Ontario and influencing policies and developments for that period of time. Now we have a change, and we're all anxious and interested to see different perspectives on this as it unfolds. So we're very pleased to have Keith Brooks with us. Keith is the Programs Director at Environmental Defense. He has extensive experience on climate and energy issues. Many of you have seen Keith in many other venues. He's also the main driving force behind the Clean Economy Alliance, which is a group of 100+ member coalition for supporting climate action and carbon pricing in Ontario. We also have Peter Howard. Peter, located in the city of Markham, is the Vice President of Sustainability at Pond Technologies. Peter is an expert on environment, sustainability, and climate change, and what global trends imply for business. At Pond Pond Technology, Peter's role includes a combination of strategy, business development, and government relations. So certainly his perspective here today will be very much valued. Joe Mulhall is past president of the Canadian Union of Skilled Workers, and Joe brings a wealth of over 45 years of experience in the energy sector. Throughout his time, and I've been there with Joe, and some of that time he has seen the ongoing restructuring of the Canadian economy and the changing scope of skills that have been necessary for workers to accommodate the transition that we're seeing in this emerging economy. So we're looking forward to Joe's perspective. And we have Laura Zizzo. Laura is the founder and CEO of Zizzo Strategy. I've known Laura also for a number of years when we were together down on Front Street in Wellington for a period of time. She is a lawyer and a strategic advisor with over a decade of experience leading organizations toward a low carbon and climate adaptive future through the application of law and policy. So I know these speakers generally know each other, and I'm looking forward to a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much again for participating. So again, the format will be, I have a number of questions, key questions to ask. We're going to begin that first question with Keith. We'll let the other three panelists comment to the degree that they want to on the question, and then we'll move to a second, third, and perhaps fourth question. Then we have some supplementary questions if we need it. And finally, if you want some questions to be asked on the chat box, please do that. We'll integrate them and bring them into the into our discussion. So I'm going to begin with the first question to Keith. So certainly on the campaign trail, we saw Doug Ford, now Premier Ford, make a number of commitments. In the environmental area, there's one or two that really stands out for us. Mr. Ford committed $500 million to deliver clean water and air, while in quotes coming down hard on companies that pollute, and certainly GHG is part of pollution. Keith, how do you think they will achieve the desired results?
Thanks, Harry. Well, I'm not sure what the results are, first off, right? Ontario has climate change targets right now that are still in law, in fact, even though we know that Premier Ford has struck down the regulation that prescribed how the cap and trade program was going to work. The Climate Change Mitigation and Low Carbon Economy Act is still in force, and that act contains legislated climate change targets. So, you know, to your point is, so how are they going to achieve the outcomes? I mean, we don't know what the outcomes are, right? I mean, are they still going to drive at those targets? We have to assume so until or unless they open up that act and get rid of the targets. At which point they're going to have to say what their targets are. And I think on climate change, I mean, the real question is, there have been two questions: is, what is the plan that this government has, and what are the targets that they're going to go at, or what are they going to try to accomplish? And we have very few answers on any of that so far. Will they? And I think that clean air and clean water are nice, good things. We actually really need both of them, but again, kind of ambiguous as to what they actually mean there. So we're gonna do our best to engage with this government and help them figure out their approach to climate change and what they want to do with some of the money that they have said they're going to allocate toward that. I think there's probably some programs that would be friendly, or that they could align themselves with. Maybe some gas conservation programs. Maybe some. Well, probably conservation is the easiest one. And even though electricity conservation has become a subject of debate during the election, I think that natural gas conservation, there's a big potential there. It's cost-effective conservation that saves everybody money, keeps more money in their pocketbooks. It's being delivered by private business. That might be something that this government could support. The other thing they've said they'd support is clean technology. And some kind of accelerator fund. So we'll have to see what that really looks like. That's kind of all I have to say right now, other than there's a ton of uncertainty as to what they want to accomplish and how they're going to accomplish it, and we just kind of have to keep an eye on it and see how things go as more information comes out.
Okay, well, let's talk a bit more, Peter, around the clean technology side. There was a comment by Premier Ford now about an emissions technology fund. Peter, can you reflect a little bit on Keith's comments, and what do you think in some of the options that the government might be able to pursue in coming down hard on companies that pollute?
Yeah, it's a great question, and probably I'm going to have to start by reflecting Keith's position that there isn't a lot of information out there now. So if you came to this webinar looking for answers, I would love to give them to you, but I'm not sure we have any. So you're absolutely right. Here's what we do know. We know that the plan for the people, the ostensible platform released by the Conservative government, was contained 4 points. Under the environmental section, it would keep Ontario beautiful by protecting and preserving waterways, improve enforcement, including conservation officers, and set up an emission reduction fund to invest in new technologies and clean up our communities. Now, exactly what any of those 4 points mean is fairly to be determined. There were not specific numbers assigned to those different points. There was a total cost in the platform of $500 million. So whether or not the emission reduction fund is 100 million or 400 million or what, and how it works, whether it leverages private sector fund or how that works, is still very much up in the air. What we do know are probably the strategic direction of the government. Keith mentioned that they're probably looking for more private sector-led things, more in line with a reduction in government involvement. I think probably a very good indication of the inclinations of this government are both the cancelling of the cap and trade system, which I assume most people know about, and also the renaming of the Ontario Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change to the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. So there are no answers out there. The initial indications seem to be that there is going to be some dramatic changes in policy and programs around this, especially with regards to cap and trade and greenhouse gas emissions. And a big part of that is the funding that was being recycled back to both polluters and small and medium businesses like Pond from the auctioning of cap and trade permits. But exactly what's going to happen now is still a little bit up in the air. I would suspect we'd be looking more at more traditional conservative roles in the environment, which are a reduction in government government regulations and more of a pivot towards a focus on private sector-led conservation efforts, and then on the government's role being mostly around enforcement of rules, along with things like park systems and conservation.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. You brought up, Peter, as well, the new name of environment, parks and conservation, or conservation and parks. Joe, what do you see in that rebranding? Is that the beginning of the PC government's softening their approach on environment, or what's your perspective on the question? What are they going to do? How are they going to achieve coming down hard on companies that pollute?
Yeah, I think we can sort of look at the PC party in a pretty general way of having been consistent over a long period of time. They generally have a look at themselves as being able to get out of the way and then create opportunities for businesses to go forward and to implement programs that are probably at this point, to say the least, they would be looking at doing something. I think we know from the website that the 500 million rate is for 4 years. It's 125 million. All the rest of it is spent somewhere else, including the legal fund that challenged the Fed. So we've got the conservation officers in place. And what we see is we're going to see that that the main theme, and I think this is consistent, is efficiency is one of the things that they always look for in everything. So they look at business and they will be looking at programs that will promote the most effective ways of doing what already is available, more so than introducing those new programs in the short term. Using the terms that we already heard, the clean air, clean water, conservation, fighting climate change, those are all very just words. I think there are a couple of really interesting things that they are saying. One of them is embracing innovation, and they actually use that term, and supporting the consumer in achieving these results through tax credits. And these kinds of approaches would be consistent with their past behaviors as well. I think on the efficiency side, investing in energy efficiency would fall clearly within the way that they see the world. And as we already know, that investing in energy efficiency is the most cost-efficient way of managing the energy system. So I think they'll be going down that kind of a path. When we talk about their brand, I think what I just described is in fact their brand, and that's what they'll try and make their brand. They'll make their brand getting out of the way, providing opportunities, embracing innovation, and being seen as responding to the need of the consumer. So, in general terms, I think the idea, such as they use again on the consumer-focused home renovation tax credit, could easily be used to improve the efficiencies in the energy sector as well as other sectors going forward. So I think all of those things come back to the same point, which is they're going to look at how do they connect with the consumer, and how do they then, someone already made this point, I'll make it again because it's who they are, is how do they actually take a stronger hand in doing that. The conservation officers, I think we can expect some form of audit. That would be typical of what we used to see for the
Right. Okay.
That's sort of my thoughts on it.
That's some really interesting points, Joe. Getting out of the way, consumer focus, and focusing on some innovation, tax credits, some themes that we're hearing in our conversation. Laura, what's your perspective on what you're hearing? How are they going to come down hard? How might you summarize some of the things you're hearing from your other panelists?
Sure. Yeah. And I agree with what the other panelists have said. And I think it comes down to this idea of sticks versus carrots for this issue. And what we've heard is this government is more inclined to go with the sticks for business and polluters and the carrots for consumers. So as much as we can get the cost savings down from a consumer perspective, hopefully we can find links to environmental objectives, but those are not entirely clear. It's more of a cost-driven approach for, the people that they are here to help. But from the stick side, I find that quite interesting. From a climate change legal perspective, as kind of a lawyer on the panel, find it very interesting because there are certainly a lot of opportunities to do more enforcement, both from a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but also an adaptation to climate impacts perspective. And we've seen really broad authority being given under the acts to the enforcement of the Environmental Protection Act here in Ontario. It's gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, saying that they have very broad authority related to the environmental laws we have in the province. So if they are actually going to see more of an enforcement lens instead of a carrot lens for polluters, that's something that businesses will really have to pay attention to. And then sort of this $500 million overall cost, it's really peanuts compared, if we're thinking about this kind of throwaway line and about the fund. It's very interesting to see how they'll use that, but I agree with what other panelists are saying. Just in the last year, we were talking about orders of magnitude more money being provided as incentives related to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and they've axed all of that for the most part. So again, I guess the theme for me is they're looking more at sticks for polluters, carrots for consumers, and we'll have to keep our eye on that. The other thing I wanted to mention was the move to securities regulators being more involved in this. So as we're looking at kind of business and the accounting aspects that Joe just discussed, there's still a big push from the regulators of securities. So the Canadian Securities Administrators, the Ontario Securities Commission, the Ministry of Finance, to be looking at this from a lens of business risk. And I think that could very well continue, which is quite interesting as well.
Laura, that's an interesting perspective on the securities point of view. I think we'll probably come back to that, I'm sure, in some of the participants' questions. And I want to encourage the participants as well who are online listening to our panelists to raise your questions on the chat box, and we'll be try to integrate them and get back to them. Laura, I'm going to start with you again. You kind of, I've heard a lot about getting out of the way, which talks about leadership, I think, and I know that you have a particular interest in this. So Laura, let me come back to you again on this. How does the switch in government change the leadership role of the business sector in advocating for sustainable practices?
Yeah, I think that we've seen this in other jurisdictions, the rise of a populist style of government, changing sort of the way that businesses feel empowered. And it doesn't necessarily have to be negative from those that are trying to innovate in a, environmentally aware and addressing climate change. In fact, we've seen in the US support galvanized from the private sector when we saw the Trump administration's withdrawal from Paris Agreement and other environmental initiatives. So I think the same is potentially possible in Ontario, and there is a strong federal government that's still focused on this, and we may have to deal with so the political uncertainty is a real issue, right? Because if we don't have the cost from the province on carbon, will we have it from the province? That uncertainty is challenging for businesses to make decisions around. But when they actually consider the carbon price and whether it's material to their business, the vast majority of businesses in Ontario will find that it's not that material, no matter what the carbon price is and where it comes from. But what could be potentially more material or business important is where investors want to put their money. So there's a real push from the investment community to look at those companies that understand climate-related risk and opportunity and are shifting their business to adapt to the low carbon and climate resilient economy. And I talked a little bit about the securities lens before, but there is a real push for climate-related financial disclosure. So any public company listeners out there, you should be thinking about this as a strategic advantage to attract investors. And whether if you have better climate-related financial disclosure, there's a real potential that investors will be drawn to your business.
Great.
Yeah.
Let me turn. We can come back to some of that later. But let me turn to Peter Howard now on that same question. Peter, this is your bread and butter. You're in clean technology yourself. You're one of these investors and entrepreneurs. What's your perspective on the question? How does the switch in government change the leadership role of the business sector in advocating for sustainable practices?
I'm more of an entrepreneur than an investor. I wish I was an investor, but we'll call me an investee. Laura's really correct here. If you had asked me whether or not the investment community is a leader or a laggard in terms of looking at climate-related disclosures and incorporating climate or just generally environmental ESG concerns, sustainable development concerns into their investment considerations, 2 years ago I'd have said they're a laggard. Today, that's really switched. Impact investing is becoming a big thing, and in fact, most investment funds with a long-term horizon, so we're talking here pension funds, maybe foundations with money, are really seriously looking at environmental and social governance, and there is a big growth in environmental and social governance and helping those decisions to make investment decisions. So this is driven by things like the evolution of the Carbon Disclosure Project, and as well the recent task force on financial related disclosures. So there's certainly much more room for leadership from the private sector. That seems to be starting to come from investors, so funds in the area. So it's an interesting time we live in. That it seems like investors are really starting to drive this. Now, I certainly wouldn't say all investors. There is certainly still a large portion of the investment community that is very focused on short-term returns and whether or not they will change or whether or not that's compatible with something like a climate change perspective that's looking at gradual temperatures over 10, 20, 50 years is a new question. But certainly climate change risk, be it regulatory risk or simply investment risk or simply risk related to adaptation or the impacts of climate change on things like insurance companies. There's much more awareness of that now in the financial community. And certainly we've seen in the US that there is leadership being taken up in the absence of leadership from the federal government, from both the private sector and from either state or municipal level, so subnational jurisdictions. In Canada, I think it'll be the opposite. In Canada, it seems like the federal government is going to step up, and there will likely be a legal battle over whether or not the federal government can simply impose a carbon tax on the provincial government in the absence of the provincial government having a carbon pricing regime, be it a tax or a cap and trade system. And our new premier has until, I believe, September 1st to actually file something with the federal government that says what his plan for carbon pricing is. And then the federal government will have a period of time where they consider whether or not that meets their requirements or whether or not there will be a federal backstop in place.
Okay, let's finish that off and let's turn to Keith. Finish it off, Peter.
Sorry, I'm being a bit long-winded here. So, I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying, right, in the absence of leadership on the provincial from the provincial side, there is certainly not a lack of enthusiasm for climate-related initiatives, both in the private sector and from the federal government. So it remains to be seen exactly what the impact will be on the overall sustainability, clean business, clean technology sphere in Ontario. But I think it's certain that the leaders are probably going to change, and whether or not we can maintain the same momentum we've had in the absence of the Green Energy Act and the climate change cap and trade system is a new question. Sorry, I'm done. Go for it, Keith.
Yeah, let's turn to Keith. Keith, again, a lot said there, and some interesting comments on the leadership side and the role of the private sector and what's happening in environment, social government. I think I heard Peter talk about. What's your perspective? How does the switch in government change the leadership role in the business sector in advocating for sustainable businesses, building on what you're hearing here?
Yeah, I hope it doesn't change it that much, to be honest, right? As Peter was saying, the federal government's going to step in now and fill this void that's been created at the provincial level with getting rid of carbon pricing. And there's not just the carbon, the cost of business, but there's a big question around the revenue and what is the federal government going to do with the $2 billion that now they'll be collecting from the people of Ontario. And I think companies should engage in that. They were engaged in the cap and trade program. They had a lot of say into where that money went. And I think there's an opportunity here to have those conversations with the federal government. It's going to be difficult for the feds to do this, but I think we need to be pushing for them to be, helping, buoy the clean tech sector and helping companies reduce their emissions like the cap and trade program was, because if the money comes back just as rebate checks, it's not going to have the impact that we need. It won't do as much on emissions, and it's not going to help with the behavior change that pricing is supposed to provoke. And there was some really transformative stuff that was happening from cap and trade. I mean, not just demand for windows and insulation and that kind of stuff because of incentive programs, but large corporate entities were making big changes to their practices because of cap and trade. So GM is investing in a cogeneration plant at their St. Catharines facility, was going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions at that plant by 75%. That was enabled from the Target GHG program that was designed to help industrial companies in Ontario reduce emissions. And so that's still going ahead because they got the money before cap and trade was killed. But other plans like that will not go ahead unless there's federal assistance to make it so, or if we find maybe the provincial government has an appetite there. But we really do want to engage with them on the revenue side, and other big business parts that look like they're up in the air now because of the cancellation of cap and trade is Enbridge was going to be going big into geothermal. They had a case in front of the Ontario Energy Board where they wanted to just install geothermal loops at new homes. They would own the loops and rent them to a homeowner like they rent a hot water heater. So here's a fossil fuel company transforming their business to sell renewable, zero carbon energy. Pretty transformative. Now the brakes are on that because of the cancellation of cap and trade. So companies really were engaged. They need to stay engaged. I mean, that's partly why we brought together the Clean Economy Alliance, is we wanted to outreach to people to get them to be educated about what carbon pricing would mean to them, and also to engage with the government on the design of the programs. And I think we need to kind of reboot that effort now and really bring it to the federal government, because they weren't anticipating having to have their carbon pricing system apply in Ontario. And I think that they need some help kind of thinking this through about how it should work and how it's going to work for Ontario-based stakeholders. And businesses
Keith, do you think businesses are going to stay engaged? Are they going to take the leadership role that you're giving us examples of here?
Well, I'm encouraging them to do so. I don't know whether they will or won't, but I think that we need business to be part of this, because it has to work for them. And businesses, there's an opportunity for them on the clean tech side if we get the programs right. And also, we businesses are a major source of emissions, and they need to reduce their emissions too. So we need businesses to get involved here big time.
Joe, I'm going to change it up here a little bit, Joe, if that's okay with you, and go to an area which I know you most from in terms of the work that you did earlier on in multi-skilling. And I'm not asking you to talk specifically about that, but what I am asking you to think about is what can we expect for the workforce during working in green businesses under the new government? How is this going to impact the workforce, Joe? Let's get down to the ground here, the people in the shops, the people in the companies, the people on the lines. How is this going to impact them? Joe, are you muted? All right. Okay. So I'll come back to Joe then.
Okay,
Maybe
I'm on.
you're on.
I
Okay.
was
Yeah.
muted, sorry.
All right.
So I think there's a few things that we need to talk about, riding on the question a little bit. And I think the line between green business and innovation is already blurred, and it's heading very quickly towards being one and the same. We're really seeing in the short term that businesses around specific products such as solar and retrofit lighting, we'll see that drop off in the near term. And it'll have an impact on that workforce in these specific areas. But really, when we look at what's going on more broadly, the development of the skilled workforce needed for the future is just starting to emerge, and it will continue. And when we look at I guess the second topic that always comes up, so I'll address it before moving on, that there's a concern that the green workforce that has been going in Ontario, there's going to be a migration, and we're going to see all of those people go off to other areas. But we've seen in the past areas such as Silicon Valley and others, and I think we need to look beyond this. For a while now, we talked about USW area and the model that we put together there. We know the workforce will need to realign with the opportunities that are emerging. And we're still talking about 1.2 million shortage in skilled workers and the challenge to have these skills homegrown. Those are things that are going to happen. But quite frankly, when we look at the innovation, what they call the Innovation Dividend, we recently attended at the Energy Roundtable Conference and had some really good discussions on what's actually driving change. And the change that's being driven impacts on the workforce directly. And we know that things are not the same. When we talked about the Innovation Dividend, we're talking about the increasing evolution and integration of high-tech solutions with growing markets and new products, and including energy storage, advanced building, cities, smart grids, digital technologies are flowing out and creating energy systems that are more intelligent. We're seeing business models and regulatory frameworks, data collection, and all of these kinds of things are shifting. And what they're also shifting, and I think coming back to that theme, is they're shifting the power of the consumer. And we had some pretty major players like TransAlta that were coming to the table and saying they can't do business like they did before. They have to change the way that they come to the product, and I think part of that is relevant here. They're no longer able to produce a product to deliver to the consumer. The consumer is requiring them to produce a product that responds to the needs of the consumer. What we're seeing here is a very similar thing going on. I think the key for us is maintaining the momentum with the consumer. And if the consumer continues to go down the path which they are around efficiencies and wanting to share in the benefits of the new industries that are emerging, I think then we're going to not really care so much. And I would have said the same words on that started off the past conversation. And I don't think that that it's going to matter much, the change in the government when it comes to these issues. I think there's other things at play. And when we come to the workforce, the key for the workforce is going to be partnering together with those that are innovating. And on the business side, and coming up with responses both from the role of business as a provider of products, and then the role of the workforce is being able to make them a success. And the conservatives, in my view, will not get in the way of any of that.
Right.
That's sort of their mantra, you know.
Okay, let's ask Laura for her perspective on that. So the question, Laura, again, what can we expect for the workforce working in green business under the new government? But we're hearing some interesting comments from Joe here, so I'm sure you'll want to bring in some of that.
Yeah, it's really, I think, quite interesting. And I think what we really need to think about for all of us that are advocates and working in this space is, what do we mean by green business? And I think it's time to really open that up. And it's about transitioning to the economy we all want to live in. And that is both around reducing emissions and regular environmental and sustainability considerations, but more and more, it also has to be about adapting to the impacts of climate change. We're seeing it every day with extreme weather and changes already. So there is a huge role for the workforce in adapting, in infrastructure development, in keeping the lights on, as the electricity workers union says, the power workers union says, that's their job, to keep the lights on. Well, what's that job look like when we have more interruptions to electricity service because of increased extreme weather events? So I found in my work over the last 15 years that talking about the impacts of climate change actually drives people to be more interested in doing all the things that solves the problem in the first place. So by broadening what we think of as green business to include everything that is true sustainability in light of all of the environmental challenges we face, in particular the impacts of climate change, I think the potential for workers is actually quite immense, and will dwarfed. Will dwarf the concerns we have right now about the short-term losses related to, lacking incentives and that sort of thing. But it's up to those of us in the space to really understand the breadth of this problem and be advocating appropriately.
Okay, thank you. Peter, what's your comment on this? What can we expect for the workforce working in green businesses? You got a green business under this new government.
Well, I mean, it certainly bears remembering that a green business is going to be composed of many different types of workers, many of which are the same as any other business. So green businesses certainly require lawyers, accountants, managers, assistants, all those sorts of things. And the remainder of the employees, at least for companies like ours, are actually taken from reasonably traditional fields as well. So we employ a lot of engineers and other biologists, chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, different folks who come from traditional industries. So manufacturing, a number of our guys come from the auto manufacturing sector. Just now they're engaged, instead of building cars, steel tanks to grow algae in. So the labor for a green business is going to share many of the skills with the manufacturing base that we're moving away from. But certainly I think the short-term impact is going to be around those who are very specialized in their training for things like perhaps solar energy installations or something like that. I'm not sure. I think those industries may, in the short term at least, have a downfall, depending on exactly what happens with the electricity policy in the province. But certainly most STEM-educated folks engaged in traditional industries are going to have a large number of transferable skills over into green industries as well. So I think that would be my perspective. I'm not sure there's, yeah.
Yeah, that's great, Peter. Yeah, thank you. That's we're going to have to take some time to digest a lot of this information we're hearing. We're not going to be able to do it all here on the panel, but lots of good fodder for thought here. I'm going to switch it up here a little bit. Just looking at my questions and my time, I'm anxious to leave the last 10 minutes at least for the participants to ask some questions. But I still have a fun question I wanted to ask Keith, at least to start off with Keith, and I'll move around again, is, we got an NDP opposition now, and we got finally, in some people's perspective, a Green Party member in the House. Keith, how is this going to change the conversation in the legislature around green business?
I can only speculate how it's going to change the conversation, and I have to be careful just to make it clear to everybody that we're not a partisan organization, and I'm not going to comment in a partisan way. But practically speaking, the Liberals were pretty good on the environment, and I don't see a lot of difference between them and the NDP or the Green Party for that matter. They all supported cap and trade. They all supported continuing with green energy. There would be some differences in their positions. I mean, the Green Party likes their fee and dividend carbon pricing model. The NDP said they'd give a bit more money to low-income Ontarians. I think those are the big differentiators in terms of the environmental platforms, at least with respect to climate change, that those three parties had. So I don't anticipate that we're going to see a lot of an injection of really new ideas on the environment into Queen's Park. Quite frankly, I think that there was good ideas that were already there. I mean, we were working away on solving this problem, and Ontario's been a leader on fighting climate change, and the Cap and Trade Bill and the Climate Change Action Plan and all that stuff really solidified Ontario as continuing that leadership position. So I think what's going to change, though, unfortunately, is the tone of the conversation at Queen's Park, where we're going to have, critics kind of, talking about the fact that looks like we're going to be moving backwards on these issues. So I'm not actually looking for, and I think it's going to become increasingly divisive and partisan. My preference would be that climate change is not a partisan issue. It shouldn't be a political football. It shouldn't be tossed about like this. It's such an important issue. And, like other panelists have said, like businesses need to engage. We can create jobs in here. There's economic opportunities. Like we really just need to do this. Anyway, I think it's going to become more divisive. I think that's what we're seeing already. There was a press release out just maybe while we were having this webinar from the government saying they're bringing back the legislature, and their first order of business is, again, to get rid of cap and trade, and they're going to put the brakes on a wind project. I mean, it's really upsetting to see the polarization on this issue and the backwards movement. So I'm not looking forward to the debate at Queen's Park, quite frankly. It's going to become, I think, more rancorous and more partisan.
Perspective.
Sorry, was that to me?
Yeah, sorry, Laura. I could see I got cut off here and come back on again. So we're on the question: will an NDP opposition and the Green Party member in the House change the conversation? Keith is talking about it becoming more divisive. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist. I couldn't work in climate change if I wasn't, because it's just too depressing. But I'm an optimist, and I think if we go back to conservative values and actually make the argument to but not be divisive. I'm concerned, as Keith is, that it's going to be divisive and not productive, and we don't have time for that. But if we can work together to kind of speak the same language and find places that there is agreement, I think there is hope that there can be progress during this term of government. There's great, some of the cabinet that has been appointed are thoughtful, and there could be great opportunity there. I think having a Green member elected is certainly important. I mean, we've seen the impact that Elizabeth May has been able to have federally. We'll see if the same can happen here in Ontario. And I agree with what Keith said. The NDP and the Liberals were quite closely aligned on major issues that I pay attention to in the climate change front. So I don't see tons of shake up on that front. Are the opposition parties going to be able to be productive in their discussions with this new government? And can we find common ground to see movement forward? Sure, hope so. And I'm going to still stay optimistic on that one.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I want to give time for the panelists, but just to turn quickly to the participants. Turn quickly to Peter and to Joe. What's your perspective on what's the conversation going to look like? Just a couple of remarks, and then we'll turn to the panel, the participants for their question. So I'll start off with you, Peter.
I try to remain optimistic, and certainly I think there's going to be room for some criticism on the other hand of the provincial government. On the other hand, the PC government under Doug Ford do have a majority government, so in theory they can pass just about whatever they want. And I'm not sure there's much that the combined forces of the Liberals, the NDP, and the one Green member can really do about that. So I try to remain optimistic, but yeah, I probably need a beer or two to maintain that optimism sometimes.
Okay, all right, Joe. What's your thoughts on the conversation? What is it going to feel like?
I think the NDP have for a number of years now taking a stand on public ownership of the energy system, particularly electricity. And if that continues to be their voice, they're going to have very little influence on anything the PCs are doing. If they look at it from a values or principle point of view, and look at what is it that we're trying to accomplish through sustainable practice, I think they can have a very effective voice. There's some folks there that understand these issues, and they can have influence and potentially at the committee level have some sway as we move forward with this agenda. But as long as they're, and I know them for many years, as long as the party is still embedded in looking forward to going back to the hydro prior to Mike Harris's 1998 Power Corporation Act, we're not going to go back to pre-98, and I think we've beaten that horse yet.
Great, thanks, Joe. That's an interesting perspective of not going back. We have a few questions from the audience, from our participants, actually quite a few. We have about another maybe 9 minutes left. I'm going to take a couple of these questions and maybe focus them on two of you for each one of the questions. So I'll start off with Peter and Keith, but with Peter, first of all, one of the questions from our participants is, what do you think will happen with investment into green power, production technologies such as wind, solar, renewable natural gas, or geothermal? So Peter, and then Keith, can you comment on that?
Sure. Who should go first? I'll go first.
Peter,
so,
yeah, Peter, you go.
Yeah, so power is a very contentious issue. I don't think that's news to anyone. Hydro rates and the increase in the hydro rates has certainly been a political football for and was arguably what took down the Wynne government. So I think a substantial part of the PC plan is going to be reforming Ontario's grid. Now, what that actually means in terms of the policy levers they can pull around perhaps the long-term energy plan or looking at some of their policy promises to the political promises to repeal the Green Energy and Economy Act. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see some moves around lowering or reducing or otherwise eliminating the things like the feed-in tariffs and the other aspects of the Green Energy and Economy Act. So it's a little unclear there exactly what will happen and how it will be done, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see the focus in the power sector shift away from renewables and towards perhaps our nuclear refurbishment or even new transmission lines. Whether or not that it's fair to blame renewables for price increases is another question, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that as a direction of the PC party. Okay,
Keith, what's your perspective? What do you think will happen with investment in green power?
I think it's going to decline. I mean, there was an article in a few of the papers, a bunch of solar manufacturers that said they're leaving Ontario and they're going to Alberta because Alberta is building out a renewable grid right now. They're supporting wind and solar in a big way, and I think it's too bad. I mean, I think actually this is one of the issues that the new government has been clear about, that they are getting rid of the Green Energy Act, and as one of their first 3 priorities, they're going to be canceling a wind farm that actually already received its notice to proceed. So there might be, I think there's going to be some financial penalties that go along with that, unfortunately. I think that investment is going to decline here in Ontario. Of course, globally, renewable energy is going to continue to grow, the exponential rates. Prices are going to continue to come down, which just means that we're going to be missing out on this, which is a real shame, given all of the capacity that's been developed in Ontario thanks to the Green Energy Act to manufacture and assemble and install and service and all green energy, all of this stuff. Lots of jobs probably at stake here. I think some of the manufacturers have said they're going to be okay because they've diversified their markets and they're selling to other jurisdictions. And green energy is still booming. It's going to be booming globally, just not here in Ontario.
Okay, thanks, Keith and Peter. So I have another question here. I'm going to direct to Laura first, and then to Joe, but the same question. I think, Laura, this might be an interesting one for you. What role do you feel municipalities can play in advocating for continued leadership?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I'm on the board of the Clean Air Partnership, so that's something that at my role as a board member there, we're thinking about quite a bit. I think municipalities have a big role to play. I think they're quite close to, the main constituents, obviously, that the PC government is quite interested in. So if they can make the case that they need support in keeping, affordability, one of the things that, immediately comes to mind is insurance affordability and the links to that sort of thing for Ontario residents. I think if municipalities can, again, going back to what I was saying around shifting the conversation to something that is engaging for this government, but also is like core to moving issues forward, there's a lot of potential for municipalities to be effective. On the other hand, municipalities are going to have a real challenge on their hands here. I think there's no way around that. Some of the cost-saving measures will likely see a push down to municipalities even further, and there's some concerns about, revenue and having enough money to pay for all the things that need to happen. Municipalities also are maybe on notice about the enforcement side of things as well, because municipalities are, some polluters, to be honest. And so they're going to have to think about this in ways of risk management and opportunities in dealing with this government. They've lost a big revenue source from the cap and trade fund, and it's going to take some creativity to move forward on these issues.
Okay, Joe, I don't want to put you on the spot. Municipalities, I'm not sure how much you're dealing with them, but what's your perspective? Is there a leadership role for municipalities in advocating for continued leadership?
It might be, absolutely. And as we know, many of the municipalities own the utilities. So when we start talking about this whole issue of reorganizing the economy around the consumer, that begins at the municipal level. And we're seeing that more and more in the electricity sector. But I think we're also seeing it in local business development. And when we start looking a little deeper at where the piece is coming from on that issue, they're going to try and stimulate business at the municipal level. Municipalities, as we know from the heritage again, and I hate to go back so much, they ended up getting downloaded a lot of things, and they had to reorganize themselves to participate. I think that municipalities in this situation are on the reverse of that. They are perfectly positioned to be the ones that create the new economy, and we're in a position where they can have a voice, and that voice, I think, can actually sway the day for the consumer on the front end, but for the industry as well.
Okay, well, that's great, Joe. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about going back to the Harris days and what impact that had. We're just about out of time here. In fact, that's our only panelist questions. I want to give each of you 15 seconds, really. That's all we really have, starting with Keith. Just a bit of a wrap up. What advice do you have for the PC government going forward? And if you can manage your time to 20 seconds, I'd appreciate it. So Keith, starting with you, what advice would you give?
Well, I mean, I think I would encourage them to do what they can on climate change. I think it's not a partisan issue. I think that Conservatives need to find a way forward for them on this issue. I think fighting the federal government on this doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not a good use of taxpayer dollars, quite frankly. I would encourage them to try to engage with Ontario stakeholders who support the province moving forward on this issue and find a way forward that fits with them.
Okay, Peter, what's your thoughts? What advice would you give Premier Ford?
My advice is that clean technologies and the emerging space for selling technologies and services that help you meet your climate change targets and help you reduce greenhouse gas emissions is a multi-trillion-dollar international global market. I think fighting against that is simply going to be trying to fight a rising tide. I think it's much more effective for him using whatever policy levers he wants to understand the breadth of that movement and to make sure Ontario takes part in it.
Okay, Joe. Do you give?
Yeah, I think just make sure that I'm on here. So I think the simple advice for them is there is a lot of good things that have happened, taking the partisan politics out of it. And so don't focus on reversing the past 15 years. We just heard exactly what we hear all the time. These are not local issues as we're talking about sustainability and climate. These are international issues. So what I recommend to them, take the positives and build for the future from here.
Right. Thank you, Joe. And Laura, what advice would you give Premier Ford?
Well, thanks. I would support what the other panelists said, and to keep it brief, I would just remind him about the term conservative, right? And to be truly conservative, we have to think about the long-term impacts of our policy choices, and climate change is helping us rethink that. So dealing with climate change is actually a conservative value. It's too bad that it's become partisan, and I would like to kind of ask that be relooked at, and it shouldn't be a partisan issue, as other panelists have said. I also would like to remind them that some of the most interesting environmental initiatives have actually been brought in Canada under conservative governments. So there's a good history of conservative governments to do amazing and innovative things for the environment, and hopefully they'll be able to do that.
Well, thank you, Laura. I want to thank you all, Keith Brooks, Peter Howard, Joe Mulhall, Laura Zizzo, for your thoughtful and reflective comments. You've provided lots of dialogue for, I know, ongoing conversations, which, of course, we're not going to be able to produce it all here today, but I'm sure it will generate many conversations across the province. So thank you very much, panelists, for giving of your time. Thank you, participants, for sharing your thoughts and your time today with us. All of this will be recorded, and it will be sent out to you sometime today after the webinar. So keep tuned, watch for additional ClimateWise webinars and workshops on these related issues. Keep connected to each other, and we'll all have an influence on what's to come in a number of years. Thank you very much, panelists, for your time, and everybody enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be on the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Harry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.